Genesis 18. I think most of us are very familiar with the Sodom and Gomorrah. I guess I could say it's an excursus. We're in the middle of talking about Abraham having a son, and then all of a sudden there's a couple of chapters where we stop and we talk about the problems at Sodom and Gomorrah. We talk about the problems with Lot and his family, his daughters in particular, and the formation of a couple of the nations that will be problems for Israel when they get back. So this is another one of those things where the Israelites are camped out at Mount Sinai. They're the first ones to get this message about Abram. And in the middle of the Abraham story, they're finding out about their ancestry. Then all of a sudden, God stops and gives them some other information about the people of the land that they're getting ready to inherit. Tonight we're going to look at Genesis 18, which is kind of the preamble of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then, Lord willing, next week we'll talk about the Sodom and Gomorrah epic itself and about Lot and his two daughters post Sodom and Gomorrah. Look at chapter 18, verse 1 to start with. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent during the heat of the day. That's an awfully casual thing to say, isn't it? The Lord, the God of heaven, Yahweh, in this translation, it has the all caps L-O-R-D. The Lord appeared to Abraham as he was sitting in the doorway to his tent. Now, for the rest of the chapter, it's kind of interchangeable to try to figure out who the Lord is in this picture. There's three guys that show up, and we'll read all this, but there's three guys that show up, and eventually we realize that two of them are angels, and one of them is the Lord. We call this a theophany, a God appearance, where he shows up in chapter 18, let's see. Verse 2, Abraham looked up and saw three men standing nearby. Okay? One of those men is God Almighty. Two of those men are angels. We find that out mainly in chapter 19, verse 1. The two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening. So they go on ahead, and God and Abraham have a talk between the two of them. They are ambassadors of God. They're on a mission for God, and he sends them on ahead. But he feels like he needs to spend a little extra time with Abraham. So it's a very interesting, kind of difficult to imagine text because of the way that God appears to Abraham. Let's go ahead and read all of 18, and then we'll go back and notice just a few things out of the text. We'll start back in 2 again. Abraham looked up and saw three men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord," and this in the NIV, that's lowercase L-O-R-D, as if you're just greeting somebody formally, not greeting Yahweh. Okay? So he says, "If we have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so that you can be refreshed and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered. "Do as you say." So Abraham hurried to the tent to Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 seahs of fine flour and knead it, bake some bread." He ran out to the herd and selected a choice, tender calf, gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and some milk and the calf that had been prepared and set those before them. While they ate, he stood nearby them under a tree. Now, we'll just stop right there. This sounds like everything happened in about 10 minutes or less. But evidently, God and the angels are in Abram's company for several hours. Right? Sarah is making bread. That's going to take a little while. He goes and gets a calf from the herd, turns that over to a servant. That has to be prepped and cooked. That's going to take a little while. So in all of that time frame, Abram actually has God and two angels sitting under a tree visiting, right? Just as if you and I showed up at one another's house and sat on the back porch and had a conversation while somebody was making dinner. So all of this is going on, takes perhaps a few hours while they are getting things ready. And at some point, and I want you to notice especially the pronoun here, where is your wife Sarah? They asked. Okay? So we don't have a singular individual asking this question. We have three general, God and two angels, we find out, but we have three individuals who are described as asking the question. He said she's in the tent. Then the Lord said, and this is capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. This is Yahweh. This is Jehovah. This is the creator of the universe. Then Yahweh said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son. Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already old, well advanced in years, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself, as she thought, after I'm worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure? Then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, I did not laugh. But he said, yes, you did. I'm sorry. It's comical to me to imagine this conversation. I realize that he has presented himself as a man, and he's having this conversation with Sarah as a man. But he is promising her the same thing that he's been promising her for 25 years or 24 years. You're going to have a child. And now he's giving her a specific timeline. This time next year, I'm going to come back for another visit, and you're going to have a child. So picture God coming back a year later, sitting under the same tree holding Isaac. Right? We don't have any scripture for the return visit, just the promised visit. I'll come back in a year, and Sarah, you'll have a child. And Sarah can't help herself. She says, oh, it's ridiculous, right? So she laughs. When we get over into chapter 20, we mentioned it last week, Abraham laughs at the same idea. The concept is just beyond their imagination, so they both laugh about it. God gives them a name for the son. The name for the son is Isaac, which in their language means laughter. So every time Sarah called Isaac to dinner, hey, laughter, come. They had to remember these exchanges that they had with the God of the universe, thinking that maybe he couldn't do what he thought that he could do. So, and you could probably write at least a good article, maybe 2 or 3, about the fear that you see in Abram and Sarai throughout their walk. And whenever they get scared, what do? They lie, right? Abram got scared, said, tell him you're just my sister, right? I'll give you to Pharaoh rather than allowing him to kill me and take you. Just tell him. So we're going to lie to get by. And so here we are with the creator of the universe having a conversation with you, and she got scared, and so she lied. But when you're lying to God, you don't get very far. So God knows what's going on in her heart and what's going on with that lie, so he calls her on it. Well, we're going to send the other two away after dinner. They have work to do. They're going to go on down to Sodom and Gomorrah. But when the men got up to leave, verse 16, they looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation. All the nations on earth will be blessed through him, for I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. Hang on to that phrase. I want him to follow me and do what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. So the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me? If not, then I will know." The men turned away and went toward Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Abraham approached him, and he said, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right?" And the Lord said, "If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake." Then Abraham spoke up again. "Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, what if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city because of 5 people? If I find 45 there," he said, "I will not destroy it." Once again he spoke to him. "What if only 40 are found there?" He said, "For the sake of 40, I will not do it." Then he said, "May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak. What if only 30 can be found there?" He answered, "I will not do it if I find 30 there." Abraham said, "Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, what if only 20 can be found there?" He said, "For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it." And then he said, "May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there?" He answered, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left, and Abraham went back home. Can you imagine? What a day, right? 3 guys show up. It's just kind of a normal day. You go and you greet them like you would greet 3 guys that came into your property, and you offer to feed them and get them something to eat. And in the course of time, you realize that this is the God of heaven and earth. These are angels that they're on a mission to Sodom and Gomorrah. Who lives at Sodom? That's where Lot lives, right? His favorite nephew, the guy that got rich off of his uncle, and they did so well together that they had to separate, right? So now Lot is in danger again, and Abraham wants to intervene. I went through and looked at a couple of other passages in the Old Testament and the New Testament that mention Sodom and Gomorrah, right? How bad a place was Sodom and Gomorrah. I think most of us are most familiar with the sexual immorality that was going on there. But look over at Ezekiel chapter 16. Ezekiel chapter 16. It's right before Daniel, if you can find Daniel back up. Ezekiel chapter 16. We're going to start reading in verse 44. What's going on in Ezekiel 16 is not a prophecy against Sodom and Gomorrah. They're already gone. It's a prophecy against Judah. Right? Israel, the northern 10 tribes, have already been wiped out. And Ezekiel is prophesying on God's behalf to the southern tier, down to Judah and Benjamin, that are still in existence. Things are getting worse and worse. A few years of following God, a few years of falling away from God, a good king, a bad king, kind of back and forth, back and forth. So here is what God says to Israel, and he uses Sodom and Gomorrah as one of the examples, and so that's where we get the extra passage about them, beginning in 16 verse 44. Everyone who quotes Proverbs will quote this proverb about you: like mother, like daughter. You are a true daughter of your mother, who despised her husband and her children. You're a true sister of your sisters, who despised their husbands and their children. Your mother was a Hittite. Your father was an Amorite. Your older sister was Samaria, who lived to the north of you with her daughters. And your younger sister, who lived to the south of you with her daughters, was Sodom. You not only walked in their ways and copied their detestable practices, but in all your ways you soon became more depraved than they. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, your sister Sodom and her daughters never did what you and your daughters have done. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. They were haughty, and they did detestable things before me. Now, what we're familiar with and what we usually think of when we think of Sodom and Gomorrah, we think of the detestable things. That's probably talking about sexual immorality. But the rest of that list is pretty strong. These were a people who just didn't care. They were going to do what they wanted to do in the way they wanted to do it, and they didn't care what God thought about it. And Judah was beginning to follow in that same line, so God says, well, you're just like your sister. You're just like Sodom. And the same kinds of things are going to happen to you that happened to Sodom. Now, he didn't rain down fire and brimstone on Judah, but he brought Babylon in and took them into captivity. So he's getting ready to bring judgment, and one of the things that he uses to back up the fact that he's bringing judgment is that they have become an awful lot like somebody he's already judged. Now, run over to the New Testament. In Luke 9. Thought I was skipping something. Luke 9, and we'll start reading in 51. As the time was approaching for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem, and he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them, and they went out to another village. Some of your translations have, he said, "You do not know what kind of spirit you are of." Okay. Probably the reason that James and John thought it was fire from heaven time was when Jesus sent them out on the limited commission, he told them, don't take any coin with you, don't take a change of clothes, don't take 2 pairs of sandals. When you come into a town, let your peace rest on that town. If they accept you, then let your peace remain with them. If they don't accept you, wipe the dust off of your feet as a testimony against them. That's what most of us remember about that passage. The next verse is, it will be more lenient for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for those towns. So James and John, when they went out on the limited commission, were told, if they don't accept you and they don't accept the gospel, then it'll be more, Sodom and Gomorrah will have a better time in the judgment than those guys do. So they go through Samaria. The Samaritans say, no, you can't stay here. You're on your way to Jerusalem. James and John say, well, is it fire and brimstone time? We'll just rain down fire and brimstone. So you can see the Israelites and Jesus and his disciples were steeped in the knowledge of what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. They used it as an example of what happens to people when they are not faithful to God. The other passage, and we won't go look at it, is in Jude verse 7, and it basically just says that God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah because of their sexual immorality. Lord willing, next week we'll take a look at some of those things. There's 4 things I want us to kind of quickly take away from this. Number 1, Abraham was a compassionate guy. I like that about him. When he took his little army and went to get Lot back from the kings that had kidnapped him, that makes you feel good about, Father of the faithful. He does some things that we question. He does some things that we wonder if we would like him or want to have lunch with him. But then he turns around and does this. If I'm living at Sodom, whether I'm a good guy or a bad guy, I want Abraham talking to God. Right? Abraham is negotiating. God, if there's 50 righteous people over there, surely you're not going to wipe them out. And then he uses that phrase, and this is a phrase that it needs to be stuck in the back of your mind and just stay there all the time. Will not the judge of all the earth do what's right? And the obvious question is, yeah. Or the obvious answer is, yeah, of course he will. So we don't have to worry about that. That part of the problem is taken care of. God will always do what's right. Well, do you remember the little snippet of the verse I wanted you to hang on to? He is going to be my man. He's going to do what's upright and righteous. Right? He's going to be a righteous guy because I am a righteous God. Abraham recognizes that in God, and Abraham is a compassionate guy. He works God all the way down to 10. What's really sad about this is there's not 10. Right? We know of Lot. Right? Lot was a righteous guy. 2 Peter talks about how God knows how to separate the righteous from the unrighteous. He destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, but he saved righteous Lot. So there was some righteous people there, but we couldn't put together 10 righteous people. Number two, God knows what's going on, but he still investigates. Did you catch that? God says, the cry about Sodom and Gomorrah has come up to me, and now I'm going to go find out if the things that I've been told are true. I don't think we should come away with the idea that God has imperfect knowledge, but that God has perfect grace and justice. Right? He doesn't just pull the trigger on Sodom and Gomorrah without first going to give a look. He sends angels, check it out. Is there something redeemable here? Is there something that we can work with here? Abraham joins in. Well, if there's 10 righteous people, can we save it for 10 righteous people? But God goes to check things out. It reminds me a little bit of the creation in chapter 1 of Genesis. God looked at the things that he had made, and they were good. Like he had to check it out. He didn't already know that what he had created was good. So there's these kind of euphemisms that kind of circle around God doing things almost in human ways, but I don't think we need to lower our estimate of God's knowledge or his understanding of what was going on. Number three, God is just. He was going to do what was right. And what was right at Sodom and Gomorrah was horrible, but it was still right. Still have a friend over at Chillicothe. They don't meet much. There's about 3 or 4 of them that meet pretty regularly, and maybe as many as 10 or 12. But this fella is a good Bible student, wonderful man, been helping to keep that congregation steady for years and years. And I've always had the habit of answering somebody will say some strong statement. I'll say, well, is that right? And he would answer me, he said, no, that's not right, but it's true. And so the thing that happened at Sodom and Gomorrah, it makes us real. We don't want to say, well, yeah, that's right, but it is true that our God is going to not simply look the other way, and that's number 4. God doesn't just turn his back on evil. We live in a generation that matches pretty well the description that Ezekiel gives, the description that we'll look at in chapter 19, the description of the way that sin works when you read over in Romans chapter 1, and Paul lists out how people turn away from God. They won't retain the thankfulness of God in their heart, and so they just walk down this path that leads to utter degradation. We live in a country that has some elements of that. Now, there are a lot of wonderful, godly people in our country, but there are some people in our country that are living as if there was no God. They're living as if God will never intervene and do anything about the things that they've chosen to do. So it's important to say that even though God checks it out, he goes down and investigates, even though he negotiates with Abram on behalf of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, even though he's a just God, he does not simply turn his back on unrighteousness and allow it to continue. And so, Lord willing, next week we'll take a look at what happens in Sodom and Gomorrah, and then a little bit beyond as we talk about Lot and his daughters. So if there's something that we can do to encourage you tonight, any way we can help you by public response, we'd love to do that as we stand.